Connection. All right. Start record. One. All right. Welcome to God at Work. I'm your host, CharlesGruver, and unfortunately, this isn't a regular episode, but I felt it would be good to give my listeners an update about what has been going on. Uh, it has been over basically a year since my last post, and if you noticed, I dropped stories of Grace and Faith from my introduction, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Uh, this year pretty much has been a crazy year with the pandemic, COVID, the elections here in the U.S. Uh, Also, where here in the U.S., it seems like people just would find or trying to find any and every reason to protest and have riots. Some of the protests are probably more legitimate than others and brought awareness to certain issues, but uh, as you have probably guessed, I've pretty much put this podcast on kind of an indefinite hiatus. And when I come back, there will be some changes. Uh, I'm kind of feeling led to take it a different direction from the stories on different historical Christians and probably focus more on Bible teaching. You notice that I'm not quite following my notes that I have right here, but I'll also get to why I'm doing this live stream and the view that you see. Uh, but that being said, I still may do some of those episodes like that. I'll probably also still be willing to do interviews of people to talking about how God has worked in their lives and through them. I know that in both cases, there's podcasts already out there that look at like the historical characters, such as 5 Minutes in Church History. It's a podcast I actually listen to quite a bit. And I noticed recently that the Christian Standard Bible also has recently put out a podcast that's kind of focused on interviewing people on how Christians on how God has been at work in their lives. Um, I will say probably those that people I interview will probably won't be all that well known because it more likely be people that I know personally. Uh, and if you want to see more of those stories and interviews uh, instead of the teaching, or if you have suggestions of people for me to interview or want to be interviewed yourself or to tell your story, uh, or if you have any other suggestions regarding the podcast, you can email me at stories@godatworkpodcast. You can see it right here. Also, I'll have it in the notes when I actually post the episode directly uh, to the various podcast things. So it'll also be in the show notes. I'm also going to edit the description on YouTube for this video to include that as well. Let's see what's next. Okay. And part of why I figured I would post this update is I've seen over the past year that even though I haven't been posting any episodes, every week there's been at least 5 or 6 people downloading episodes. So I know people are or at least it looks like people are listening to the podcast. I also noticed on YouTube video counts that some people have come across the videos. There's been some that they've watched longer than others. But again, people are watching and listening to this, so I figured I may as well let people know that, one, I'm still alive, and two, I haven't given up on the podcast. I just haven't had the motivation to look into characters and get the whole setup going to record. Or also, as I said, was me feeling led to kind of take it a different direction and doing more on the Bible teaching, just to sit down, take the time, go through and start going through a passage, to go verse by verse through it, to present a teaching, and to start doing that. I'm not sure what my posting schedule will be when I start back up, whether it'll be I'll stick to the 2 times a month. I'll try to do that. But it all also depends on my regular work schedule and everything else. The other reason why I decided to post this update is to basically test a setup I have for live streaming video. It's mostly for use with my church, which it's kind of funny, and I'll get to that in a little bit, that I'm using my podcast to test out a live stream setup for my church to make sure that what I have in a pinch can work for them. But then I'm going to see about trying to use another setup to test out some possibilities in regards to the Becoming God's Man podcast, basically the prayer breakfast we do every Friday morning, because they're looking at finally getting back into the group that we're doing now has been doing Zoom since the pandemic started, basically, and they're actually looking at possibly going back to a restaurant, and me using my church's Wednesday night Zoom Bible study to try a recording setup with Zoom and some possibilities, as well as will give me a chance to see if I can set up a mixed Zoom and live recording setup for when they do either get back to a restaurant, or another option of a mixed was going to a Central Christian Church, because the group that we're working with now is the Band of Brothers out of Central Christian Church in St. Petersburg. So, and as I said, that podcast, Becoming God's Man, has been going since about September. Right now, they've been doing a study on the Gospel of Mark that pretty much started at the beginning of this year. We're only 11 weeks into it, and on Mark chapter 10, if you want to, you can go to either our Becoming God's Man YouTube page, which I'll link in here, or .com, to find just the audio version of the Bible study. Well, I guess that's it for this update. Keep an eye out for when I get some episodes ready to start actually recording and posting again. And as I mentioned, you can go over to becominggodsman.com and subscribe to the Friday Morning Prayer Breakfast podcast. And basically go with us as we go through the Gospel of Mark. So again, this is CharlesGruver, and that's God at Work.